Conversations with the Mind podcast, where we explore consciousness through conversations with interesting people. Our mission is to engage the collective mind piece by piece to bring greater clarity of mind to our listeners locally and across the planet, and to contribute to broaden the shared experiential knowledge and wisdom of existence. Okay, folks, welcome back to Conversations with the Mind. I'm your host, Shane Lemaster, and we're here for episode number 94 with very special guest, Nicole Blanchette. Did I say that right?
You sure did. You nailed it.
Awesome. Yeah, sometimes I get guests on here with names that are much more difficult than yours to pronounce, so I'm very grateful.
You should hear the variations I've gotten over my life.
Yeah, what have you gotten?
Interesting. The biggest one is Blanchette. That's the biggest.
Nice.
That one comes out all the time. Blanche or Blanchetti. I've had Blanchetti before. It's just whatever they feel like, just comes right.
Yeah, I think I get most misspokenness around my name with my first name. So it's Shane, but a lot of people call me Sean or something like that. And my last name isn't too hard, but I'll get weird pronunciations, and I always just say, like, I've been called way worse. Than Sean, so it's no big deal.
Oh yeah. You just learn to roll with it at a certain point. Right. At a certain age, like when I was in school and teachers would always say it wrong, instead of correcting them, I'd just be like, yep, that's correct. You can just, I'm not going to get through this to you. It's all right.
Mm-hmm. So the podcast is called Conversations with the Mind. And the only standard question that I ask my guests is the same every time. And that is, when you hear the phrase "conversations with the mind," what comes up for you? Like, what does that phrase mean to you in your life and your experience? What sort of pictures or memories or visualizations come up for you when you hear the phrase "conversations with the mind"?
For me, when I hear that, I think of how we are as people, the layers we have, right? And you peel back the layers to get to the core. And so to me, when I hear that phrase, I think getting to the core of the person, like peeling back the superficial, peeling back the surface level and saying, okay, I'm going to get deep down to what matters, to who you truly are, to what makes you tick, to what makes you go, like, what is it? And so that's what I think of as like that deep-seated, really down in there type of stuff about someone.
Yeah, so you talk about multiple layers, but two main classifications, I guess, of layers or compartments, where some is surface level and then there's the core self. And so I'm wondering if you can pick that apart a little bit and how you think about it. So what are some surface level things you consider surface level? Would that be like identity stuff? Would that be ego-based stuff? What would surface level be?
Absolutely. When I think surface level, I think of the ego-based, right? How we are maybe concerned with our presentations of ourselves to others and saying, how do I keep up appearances? How do I impress? How do I get this person to like me, right? Like more of like a preoccupation with the perceptions of others, and how do we satisfy that or meet that or live up to what we've construed in our own minds. That's what the surface level is to me, is really just, I would say superficial is the word that comes right to mind. But yeah, just how do we appease what we want people to think about us and feel about us?
Mm-hmm. It's interesting you use the word superficial. I think most people, at least in our culture, hold almost like a negative connotation with that word, right? Superficial, meaning like the fake or, the parts of ourself that are an illusion or something like that. I just took this great class last semester called Metaphysics of the Self. And one of the theories of self that we studied that was one of my most favorite and probably will find its way into my dissertation is this idea that we construct ourselves through a narrative, right? So the stories that we tell about ourselves. And, it's not only it's not only internal stories that we tell about ourselves, but there's a huge relational component to this idea of the narrative self too, that it's, our narrative is not just built by us, but it's built in relation to other people and to other objects and other things in our life too. And so it has like this dual system interaction working together. And I love how you brought up that piece with the superficial about, you know, what the stories we tell ourselves based on like what other people think about us or how other people perceive us. And that gets worked into our narrative, whether we like it or not. And we can have like defenses up against that. Right. And,
Mhm.
um, there's people that I'm very envious of that are able to say like, oh, well, that person's just judging me. No big deal. I don't really care about their judgment. But most of us, I think, do care what other people
Mhm.
think about us and how other people see us and how other people see us in relation to them. And so naturally, I think we integrate some of that relational stuff into our own narrative, and it becomes personalized and it becomes part of the story that we tell ourselves about who we are.
And well, to touch on two things, the first is I think superficial can actually be like a way to protect ourselves, right? Like it's really hard to be vulnerable. I mean, in therapy, that's what we strive for, right? We want people to be vulnerable, to present their true self, to be open and honest and transparent. But being vulnerable is hard because it's a little dangerous. If you put yourself out there and if you get rejected or shot down or whatever it may be, hurt in some way, then you've started to mess with the ego a little bit, right? So I think that's why superficial comes back to this, as you said, preconceived notion of like this negative thing. But I think it can be protective. Like, hey, I want to make sure this person likes me. But if you think too, I don't know if this is accurate, this is just a thought I had. But when we think back to how we kind of started with being in tribes and a village, like you want your tribe and your village to like you and to support you and all that because it's a means of survival, right? Like getting along with the people in the community, that's going to help you survive and make it through. So I, like you said, it doesn't have to be like this negative connotation because I think it serves a purpose and it does good for us. So yeah, people are like, oh, superficial, that's this awful thing. But I feel like it does serve a purpose in some way.
Yeah, when you're talking about the vulnerability piece, that struck a chord for me. And I've been trying to practice being more vulnerable these days, right? Because
Oh yeah.
recently I was talking to some close friends in close circles, many different circles, and all within 1 week, I was getting the same feedback from a number of different circles, and that was that I'm being a martial artist and things like that. Like I'm like just over 200 pounds. Like I'm a rather large physical person, even though I don't know my own size. Like my wife tells me all the time, she's like, you don't know what sort of vibe you put off to other people, especially when you don't smile. I'm like, what? I'm like a super nice person. Um, but I was getting this feedback that like I was taking up a lot of space, right? Not just physical space, but like um, energetic space in all sorts of places because I'm outgoing and I like to talk a lot and um, you know all these things. And so I'm getting all this feedback, and a big part of me is my masculinity, and it's like that's an important piece to me, and it doesn't certainly doesn't go into the area of like what people call toxic masculinity or anything like that, where it's like stepping on other people in favor of myself or something like that. But um my masculinity is something that I haven't always had. I was raised by my mom only. And so it was something that I had to like develop, and I developed it through the martial arts and really was empowered into my own masculine skin and my masculine self. And so that has been like one of my driving energetic forces in my life.
Mm-hmm.
And I received this feedback, and then all of a sudden, I'm hit with like, oh my goodness, like this person that others are perceiving me as um, might be too much for them, even though it's
Mhm.
empowering for me, might be too much for them or for this world or whatever. And so I had to like re-examine that part of myself. And what I'm really trying to work on now is um, because I believe we all have like a masculine and a feminine energy within us, right? And um, most men in our culture are taught to play down or extinguish the feminine energy altogether. And I think that's sort of what I was taught through, hanging out with guys and things like that. And I'm coming to realize that I was completely out of balance by only feeding the masculine side of myself. So now um, I'm trying to engage my own feminine energies and
Mhm.
things like that to, the nurturing side of myself, the caring, the listening, those parts of myself that are naturally more feminine. And a part of that is forcing myself to be vulnerable. And when you were talking about the vulnerability, um, I can remember very clearly the times where I have put myself in places where, or in conversation where I force myself to be vulnerable, and it literally feels like when I do that, it literally feels like I am like a raw nerve. Like I have a zero protection on that nerve, and if a breeze comes by and touches that nerve, like it's scary, it's fearful, it hurts, all these things. And so, I naturally my defenses would come back on and I put that shield back up on that nerve, but then I have to convince myself, with, cognitive reprogramming and stuff like, okay, this is okay. You're safe. You're safe. Let these defenses down. It's okay to feel scared. It's okay to feel vulnerable. And I
Mhm.
can't tell you how much I feel like I've grown just by acknowledging that other side of myself and trying to bring back into balance. It's sort of like that yin yang, right? And that's almost exactly what that symbol means, is like the two energies within us all, and they need to be in balance, right? The colors in that diagram are completely symmetrical and equal. They're not one overpowering the other, and there's even pieces of each energy within each other energy. So when you're talking about vulnerability, that's what it brought up for me, was that raw nerve piece and the sort of journey I'm trying to do to soften a little bit.
Yes, and my real lesson in vulnerability came when I was in my master's program, and I went to Columbia, which is in Manhattan, so lots of diversity, lots of people from different backgrounds, um, really dominant like personalities. Well, we all had to do, group counseling class. But group counseling, the course was you participating in counseling.
Mhm.
And so, I've done individual therapy and that works great, but I was really iffy about group therapy. Just because I was like, oh my God, I'm going to have to talk in front of these people. Like, what do I say? Well, there was a lot of tension in this class all the time. And there was a lot of like butting heads and conflict within the group. But as the group progressed through the term, we went from being really kind of like angry and kind of bitter towards each other. It's like, well, you said this thing and it it made me get defensive. And then as we all became more vulnerable, it evolved and we got to a point where we could speak to one another without that judgment, that cloud of judgment hanging over us, or I'm I'm being attacked and being criticized, whatever. It taught us all, and it taught me especially, how do you just allow yourself to be present, present who you are, and then receive feedback about it in such a way that you can accept the feedback, take it on, and then integrate it into your life in a way that's useful. And it was like this tipping point, because I remember for midterm evaluation, we went into the professor's office and both of the TAs were there, and you're like being swarmed by the professor and the TAs, and it was so nerve-wracking. And they gave you feedback and they were like, you know a lot of people have been really angry in the group, and you seem kind of angry when you're there. And I'm like, what? I seem angry? I'm thinking I must be really happy and I must look very like well put together in the sense of like, oh, I'm not letting this bother me right now. I thought I was like very composed and like I had it together and I had my poker face on, but clearly not. It wasn't. They were like, you've got some anger with the group. And I went in, and the next time I went in, I'm sitting in group and I was like, oh my God, I'm super angry right now. And I feel it on my face. And it brought it into our awareness. And I think being vulnerable can let things come into your awareness, just like it came into your awareness of kind of your dueling halves. It comes into the awareness. And so there's so much to be gained by being vulnerable.
Mm.
And until I feel like you've really started to accept like how to be vulnerable, it's hard. It takes so much practice. So I remember that class changed my life. It changed how I presented myself. It changed how vulnerable I was with others. And it changed how I received feedback about myself. I went from, I mean, I'm human. I'll still get defensive. I'll still think I'm being criticized, but I could do it in much more of an open mind. Like I could stop and say, okay, I'm drawing a line here. This is where I am. This is how I perceive myself. And that person is over there. And like they're entitled to their opinion and they can think what they want. And how do I take that without this heavy, like emotional baggage attached to it, right? Like, how do I cut the cord from the emotion and say, okay, how do I just take this as information? Purely that information, and like how do I integrate that information to improve myself. But ooh, that was a wild semester. It was a rough one, but survived the course. And yeah, came out just being able to be like, okay, how do I work on myself? Like, how do I become vulnerable, get feedback, and work on myself from that? And it did. It really opened my eyes.
Yeah, that's really, I mean, it's beautiful how you just said it. But it's really hard to separate the emotional component from the information, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think most people probably, without any sort of mindfulness or awareness type training or something, have a difficulty, or yeah, a real difficulty like untangling those two from each other. Um, and you were talking about being vulnerable and receiving um, information in that state, and
Mm-hmm.
that's what I find too. Like being vulnerable is opening. It's almost like an opening, right? You open yourself up to whatever is coming. You open yourself up to
Mm-hmm.
criticism, to pain, to hurt, but also to beneficial information that's going to help you grow, that's going to help you learn, and that's that opening, right? And I think that, the opposite of being vulnerable is being, sheltered or closed off and super
Mm-hmm.
defensive. And that's the opposite of being open, right? It's like you have a barrier up. You can't accept positive or negative feedback. So yeah, I love the way you put that. I'm curious. So you went to school in New York, and that's New York City?
Yep,
Yeah.
right in the
So
heart of Manhattan.
so did you live in the city when you were going to school?
I did. I'm from a small town. Like we're talking, you know, all the all the cows and the chickens and the soybean fields you can imagine. Like you got it all here. Um, like I went to school literally in the middle of like cornfields. Like you looked out the window and you saw the fields around. So I grew up in a really small town, but I'm really fortunate because, my parents are my dad's from Boston, my mom's from England. So living in Maryland, we were traveling a lot to go see family and things like that so they could go back to their hometown. So I was really fortunate that like I had all that travel experience because if not, it would have been such culture shock when I moved to New York. I mean, it's just a big bustling city. Um, oh, it's just so diverse and it's just full of life. Like it's really great in the beginning, but then you kind of do all the fun stuff. You get all the touristy things out of the way, and then you just are like, oh God, I'm like, the subway is always running late. The AC doesn't work. I have to carry my clothes to the laundromat. Like, I grew like a love-hate relationship with New York. So it was like on one hand there were all these fabulous things, and then on the other hand there were like all these things I was like, oh God, I could do without that in my life. Um, so it was a love-hate relationship in New York. Um, but it was a time where I learned a lot. Like I said, if I had just never left this small town and gone, I think it would have been like a really big slap in the face, like a wake up call. But it's just so different. You know, you have the subway and you have all the, tourist attractions, and, it's really bustling and big. And yeah, so it was love hate. It was love hate. But am I happy to be out of New York? I am. It just wasn't a good fit for me anymore. But I had quite an interesting time while I was there, because after I finished school, after I graduated, I stayed in the city to work for a little while. And so I was doing therapy in New York. So that was a very interesting experience. And being an intern in New York City, um, being an intern in therapy in New York City is also very interesting as well. So it was a yeah, interesting is the best word to
Mhm.
describe it.
Yeah, I've only been in New York City once, and it was only for, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 hours. We took a
Hmm.
train from Connecticut into the city. My friend took me, and I was really high that day, and this was in high school. So we must have walked like 40 blocks in the time that we were there, and I don't remember hardly any of it because it all just seemed the same to me in the altered state that I was in. Um, Almost got arrested for trying to buy a fake ID,
Okay, all
at
right.
18. um, but I've always wanted to go back there as an adult and to experience it for a little bit longer than 5 or 6 hours. And we're binge watching this show right now during our Christmas break called High Maintenance on Amazon, and it's about this weed delivery guy who delivers weed in New York City on his bicycle. And
Yep.
have you seen it?
Oh yeah,
Yeah, and
that's a thing. It
I,
is
yeah,
a
yeah, and I love this show because it's not. I mean, it is a little bit about the main character, the weed dealer, but it's more about like his clients and their individual lives, and you get to see like the wide diversity of different lives and lifestyles and life problems that are going on in such a big city like that. It's not like a small town where almost everybody in the town has similar problems. And so, when you're living there in New York, I definitely want to hear about what it's like to do therapy in such a diverse type of city. I'm sure you get all sorts of interesting issues, but one thing that really fascinates me because of this show that we're watching is that you could ride your bike through the city and get rid of all the touristy stuff. That's all well and good, but like to really feel what the culture of the actual city is like and what the people are like and what the energy is like in there. I just think that you would run into, like, you could never run into the same type of person twice. Like you'd walk a couple blocks and you'd meet somebody who has a personality that you didn't even know could exist because there are so many millions of people there. It just seems like it's a petri dish, a human experiment that you could literally go outside your apartment, walk around for a couple hours, and have the time of your life as a fellow lover of human psychology and just people watching and just looking at the city and what it is like.
Oh, I had a little routine. I mean, I'm definitely like an introvert, kind of like a lone wolf. Like, I'm cool on my own. I like time to myself. So after I graduated and I was working there, I had this routine where I would go get bubble tea. I'd just put in my headphones. I'd put on a certain playlist, play the Spotify. I'd go get bubble tea. Then I'd walk to the park, sit on the bench, and just sit there for 30 minutes, 45 minutes, drink my bubble tea, maybe an hour, and just observe and like just sit and take everything in. And that was like that was one of my versions of self care, was sitting in the park drinking bubble tea and just looking at the what was happening around me. And I did that every few days. I would do that. Um, and there's just you couldn't even imagine all the things you would see in New York. I mean, talk about the things you see on the subway, and even when you're just walking down the street, what you see, what I saw working in therapy, what I saw being in school there. Um, but it really is, it's just like this big melting pot of people with such diverse backgrounds, like all coming together in this one place. Yeah, there's so many stories. There were so many things I saw and observed there. It was a wild time seeing those things, but I did. I loved just like sitting and people watching. I was like, this is like my thing. This is what I do. And I just dug it so much. That was my little routine, and it was a great way to just like recharge after a long day.
Yeah, it seems like it's sort of like a human zoo where you go and you
Yeah.
see all these different animals. Um, so being, I mean, with your psychology background too, do you, and coming from a small town, I think this would be interesting for me to know too, because I think the biggest city around me is Denver. You know, the city I live in right now, Fort Collins, I think has maybe a couple 100,000 people in it. So but it's a sprawling city, and it only has that high of population when school's in session, you know, because we're built around the university, which has 40,000 people. But you know, as someone who's observed both small town and big city, do you feel like, and this is just like a total assumption on my part, but I would assume that in a bigger city, you would see much higher rates of what could be, you know, classified by the DSM as like psychosis or neurosis or narcissism or, you know, any number of mental health issues, I think would be um, well, number one, way more prevalent because of the number of people there, but it just seems like per capita, the rates would be much higher than in a small town because, you know, all the pressure being packed in, you know, high stress, high anxiety, fast moving environments. Um, I mean, what do you observe on that note?
Definitely. So, I mean, I'm pretty fortunate because I've been able to do therapy in New York and also in my hometown. So, I've had the mental health experience in both settings, and it really is vastly different. Um, so, as a part of my doctorate, I completed a 1 year internship. And so, I did the internship in my hometown. And for example, we'd have treatment team meetings and we'd be discussing clients, and, someone would say, oh, my person has narcissism, and I have another person who has dissociative identity disorder, and I have three clients with borderline. And I was like, hold on a second. Let's stop and think for a moment. I was like, I've seen these things in person in New York, and I can't quite agree with that diagnosis. But I was like, you're also like the statistics on it. You can't be in a small town and have, you know, your client base is X number of people, and you're saying a huge percentage of that is personality disorders. It doesn't work out that way. We know the stats, we know the prevalence rates. You'd have to be like this like anomaly to have that many clients in a small town with so many personality disorders, for example. um, so I think it's interesting because how is it that you take that context and the client presentation and come up with something so severe so often, right? Like, it's like, this is interesting because it lends us insight into the culture of what this community is. And then when the mental health issues manifest, what does that look like? And in this small town, again, we'd be in treatment team meetings, and there was a lot of people saying they had a lot of clients with personality disorders. And I was like, it's just not a statistic probability either, on top of just not agreeing with the diagnosis. So then you shift over to New York, and it's really wild because you do see it. because there are so many people. So you get that hands-on experience with diagnoses that you may not get to experience in other settings. There was plenty of personality disorders, plenty, like you said, psychosis. I mean, I would say when I was in New York, I did an internship and I worked. Um, I would say that 90% of my clients had schizophrenia. I mean, granted, I was working in, um, you know, the public health sector. I wasn't in like a private practice or anything like that. So the way the system is, it's so inundated. And unfortunately, these people with severe mental illness, they drop through the cracks, they don't get seen, and they're just stuck in these systems, not really getting quality treatment all the time just because there's so much and there's not enough resources to help. But yeah, that's the prevalence then in that setting is, like you said, the psychosis, a lot of schizophrenia, though. It was so much schizophrenia, a lot of histories of abuse and trauma, especially in childhood. So you see like these polar opposites when you look at these settings. When I was working in my hometown, I was like, man, I am way less stressed being a therapist here than I was in New York City. So I think setting has a huge part to play in it. Um, I mean, again, the stats of it, just if you have millions of people, you're bound to see X number of cases. Whereas if you're in a small town, and if over the course of 1 year I have 100 clients, it's going to be a lot less likely, that I'm going to be seeing these really severe things in large quantities. So yeah, I think environment has a huge part to play in it, and it really does contribute to the types of cases that you see.
Yeah, and I mean, we know that genes only contribute 50% or probably less than 50% towards any mental health issue, and environment plays a lot bigger role. So, what do you think it is about New York City and that environment and that culture? What is it about those, cultural, environmental things that you think have such an impact on the mental health? I mean, I can maybe imagine, like, because people are stacked on each other in New York, living in tiny little apartments with thin walls, and I can imagine someone who might have a genetic predisposition for schizophrenia or another diagnosis where they hear voices or something, in that environment where you can't tell whether you're actually hearing your neighbor next door through the wall or the ceiling versus you're actually hearing something that's not necessarily there. Um, like, I can imagine an environment like that where you're always second guessing, where these voices are coming from. Um, like that could be an example of how the environment might contribute to higher diagnoses like that. So, what do you think it is about the culture and the environment that sort of makes those prevalence rates even higher?
There are just so many stressors in New York.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, for like you said about talking about housing, like for example, it's really hard to pay rent in New York. I mean, you're either you're either living a super luxurious life or you have like three or four or five roommates even, and you're getting like a closet sized bedroom in like a 4 bedroom apartment, and even that's really expensive, paying you can pay $1,400, $1,200, $1,000 for a room within an apartment that has 4 or 5 roommates in it. That's not out of the question. So if you can't afford that, you're probably going to end up homeless.
Mm.
And they don't have the resources to help that number of, people that are homeless. And so it's like, once you become homeless, then are you stuck in homeless shelters? And then if you're a child, I worked with some kids that worked in or that lived in homeless shelters, um, and they would experience a lot of traumatic things. So it's like maybe your parent was in a homeless shelter, they were unable to get out of that situation. So then you're raised in that environment as well. And that's really stressful as a kid to be growing up in a homeless shelter and not to feel safe, not to feel secure. So I think just the everyday like trying to make it and trying to survive and say, can I pay my rent? Can I buy groceries? Like if I have those expenses at the end of the month, what money am I left with to live on? So like that's a huge stressor, I think. Um, I think too, like there's this thing of like everyone's got to make it in New York, right? It's like you got to make it. Are you trying? I knew plenty of people that were trying to go for acting or singing or like something music related. Um, and there's this culture of like always trying to get there but feeling like you don't get there. I mean, when you look at the numbers, how many people actually do make it big out of the number of people who try,
Mhm.
and that's not to say, oh, you shouldn't try, but that's like a culture, right? Like always trying to be at the top, and the fight to get there and like how hard that is.
Mhm.
um that's that's a part of the culture. um it's just like all these, like you said, it's all these environmental factors that I think can trigger, like you said, the genetic component, and that can set that off is is a part of it, I think. But yeah, I would just say all the stressors. It was one stressful thing after another, and then you hear these people's stories, and it's like childhood abuse, substance use, um trauma, a lot of PTSD when I was working in New York. A lot of people had PTSD, so trauma, just things like that really, I think, contribute to the cases and for that happening.
Yeah, and I don't know if this necessarily contributes to mental health or not, but like you were talking about always trying to make it, I feel like there's a much higher sense of competitiveness in an environment like that, like compared to like a smaller town where it's more community based and people are out there helping each other make it, and if people are falling behind on, payments on the farm or something, they may get help from a neighbor or something like that. Whereas in New York, it seems like it's every man or woman for themselves,
Mhm.
and there people are more willing um, to step over or step on others in order to help themselves climb that ladder.
Yeah, it's a very cutthroat
Mm,
culture. I
hard.
remember just, being at Columbia, being at an Ivy League school was really, really hard because it was so cutthroat, right? Like, you take all the people who are, you know, high achievers, you pull them all out of their communities, and then you put them together in a new community against each other. And it was so competitive. I mean, I remember the amount of stress that gave me. It was very cutthroat, like in all my classes with all my peers. I mean, they were great people, super nice, super understanding, but there was always this edge where you're trying to edge out the person next to you in class. It's like, can I get the better grade? Can I get, and again, maybe not everyone felt that way, but that's how I felt being there, was like, you're taking people from all these different backgrounds who were at the top in their background, you bring them together, and then the competition becomes even more fierce.
Mhm.
And it was constant cutthroat. It was like, who got what fraction of a percentage higher on the assignment. um but it wasn't, I'm not really a competitive person. Like when I do jujitsu, I don't like, competitions aren't for me. I'm like, oh, I just like to go get my workout in. So being in that competitive environment was like not me. And I would be like freaking out. I'd be like, oh my God, I cannot handle this right now.
Mhm.
Like let's simmer down, people. It's okay.
Mhm.
But it's so cutthroat. And everyone is like, again, not to say that New Yorkers aren't caring or considerate or compassionate, but a lot of people just have like their blinders on, that tunnel vision of like, I need to get this thing done. I need to achieve this thing. And it's about, again, that competitive climb to the top,
Mm.
and just focusing on what you need and what you need to get done. And again, not to say they're selfish, but it's just a different attitude. It's just like, okay, I'm going to focus on getting X, Y, and Z achieved, and I'm going to do what it takes to get there. But there is a lot of competition.
Sure. I want to kind of segue to a different topic that I'm interested in about you, but it also is sort of has a component. This question I want to ask has a component sort of comparing small town versus big city. So you have a bachelor's degree in criminology and did you say psychology or forensic psychology?
Psychology.
Psychology. Okay. So right away when you told me that, I keyed in on that because that was one of the main reasons I wanted to get into psychology in the first place. Was I wanted to become a forensic psychologist and work for the FBI or something, trying to catch serial killers and really like getting into the minds of people, like our biggest outliers in our
Mm,
society, like those who find it okay and find ways to justify, harming and hurting others on a mass scale like that. And so that was fascinating to me. Like, how can people think this way? And I really wanted to get into their minds. And so I watched all sorts of serial killer movies and like Jack the Ripper and, that movie Seven and Hannibal Lecter and all these things. They just fascinated me. And so I want to hear about your interest in that and how sort of got keyed into that as well. But my question for you is, and I don't know the answer to this. So, as far as like numbers of serial killers in our history, do more of them come from small communities or do more of them come from big cities? Because I hear about people like the Zodiac killer in bigger cities. Um, Jack the Ripper even was in a big city, what was considered a big city back in the day. But then I also hear, I think people like wasn't John Wayne Gacy from a smaller town or
like a suburb, I believe.
yeah, something like that. And I think Charles Manson started out in a small community, but ended up migrating to larger cities and things like that. So I want to hear about your interest in that and how you got interested in that. But also, I'm curious, like through you looking into this topic, like what have you found as far as like prevalence among cities? Because this sort of factors into the idea that larger cities might produce more. Or initiate more psychosis in individuals where it might not otherwise if we were more spread out.
Yeah, absolutely. So, um, my interest in I had all different interests in terms of what I was going to do in college. First, it was like I was going to go into nuclear engineering. I actually got accepted to ASU for that because my dad was an engineer, and I was like, oh, I'm a lot like my dad, and people say I'm a lot like him, and I'll follow his footsteps, that whole thing. So I was like, okay, nuclear engineering seems interesting. I actually got accepted to ASU, and then I was like, no, I'm gonna, not do that. So I was like, I'm gonna go to community college first. I was like, I don't know what I want to do. I just know what I like, and I'll go to community college to play around and see what I'm gonna pursue. So I actually, same thing, loved watching forensic files and, all the serial killer documentaries and reading the books and all that kind of stuff. So I was like, okay, I'll go into criminology. And I wanted to be a crime scene investigator, actually. That's what my kind of dream job was. Um, and so I signed up for the criminology program. I did all my courses, and I quickly came to learn that in this area, so again, this could be a difference between small towns and cities, but in the area where I lived and I went to community college, crime scene investigation was a part-time job.
Mm.
They didn't have enough crimes really happening that you would just be working in a full-time job. It was a part-time on-call job. I mean, I don't know if it's changed, but that's what it was when I was studying criminology in 2007. So um, I I was like, damn it, like what do I do now? Like I can't be a crime scene investigator. I need a full-time job. So I was like, I'll be a detective. And then I found out you had to be a cop to be a detective. And I was like, I don't want to be a cop. So I was like, oh, forget that. So I actually took a serial killer class as one of my courses, and it was all about serial killers. And I was like, man, the psychology of it is so interesting.
Mm.
And we learned all about profiling and the FBI. And I was like, that is awesome stuff. So I was like, okay, I'm going to pursue psychology as well. So that's how criminology and psychology came up. Um, so after I did 2 years at community college, I went to the University of Maryland, and I actually worked as a research assistant, and our studies were in forensic psychology. Um, and at the time, we were studying something called verbal overshadowing, which is the premise is basically when you have someone come in as an eyewitness to describe a crime and to describe what they saw, to describe a person, turns out most people suck at describing perpetrators. They can't do it. They don't do it well. This is just a thing people aren't very good at. And it you do even worse when you try to identify someone of a different race or ethnicity than yourself. So once that comes into play, then you really, really suck, right? And if you have someone try to describe the person first, I believe that this is what it was. This has been a few years, so I could be a little off, but your accuracy goes down. You should have them write it down. These are the things we were discovering, right? Like if you write something down versus if you actually verbalize it, is your accuracy even worse off?
Mm.
So I did that research assistant work. Loved, loved, loved forensic psychology. Um, and then I was like, you know what? I want to get into counseling. But that was kind of my transition from criminal justice and criminology into psychology, but it was just really born out of interest. I took a lot of great courses, things about serial killers and victimology and juvenile delinquency. But speaking to your question about like big cities versus small towns, I think that's interesting, right? I think it's like what's the motivation behind the setting, right? Like you said, are there higher rates in big cities that would just lend to it occurring more? Um, is it easier to find a victim in a big city, right? Like, hello, you got your pick, you got every shape, size, color, age, whatever in a big city. So if you're a serial killer, you tend to have your kind of like profile of your typical victim. What are you looking for? Man, woman, young, old, whatever. Um, so there's more opportunities for them to find their ideal victim. So it would seem like almost like in a big city, it could be a matter of convenience, right? Like it's just more convenient. Um, is your crime going to maybe fall through the cracks a bit easier because police are so preoccupied with so many cases and so many issues? If you commit a crime in a city, do you have a better chance of maybe it not being reported or not being investigated? I don't know. Where I live in a small town, like they constantly do radar, and when they find someone with a little bit of weed in their car, there are 6 state troopers,
Mhm.
patting the person down. And it's like when I lived in New York, you just walk past people on the street smoking a joint or popping a pill or whatever, doing drugs on the street. I would see it. I've seen people do that. No one bats an eye because they're kind of, bigger fish to fry per se. So it's like, could you get away with it in a big city? Whereas, like I said, in the small town, you drive by a car and they're sitting on the curb or they're sitting on the side of the road and there's literally 5 or 6 state troopers and you're like, oh, they probably had a joint. Like,
Mm,
that's probably what happened. It's just the resources, right? Like, we have plenty of resources here, but the crimes aren't occurring at the same rate. So they occupy themselves with other things.
sure.
So it's really interesting. So I think it's probably access, the ease at which it can happen, and how how likely you are to get away with it. Um, so I would love to know the facts on that though, like the actual stats on like, is it that they come more from big cities or small towns? I find that super interesting. That's a great question. Um, I wish I had the exact answer, but that's my thoughts on it because I do. I think those are probably some key factors in all of it.
Yeah, and the motivation factor I think is a really interesting angle too. Like what what motivates the people from different locations to even want to engage in it. Is cannabis not legal where you're at?
So, we do have medical marijuana in Maryland, and then I know that they decriminalized a certain amount.
Mhm.
Um, but again, it's a small town. Like, when you go to, if you ever look at like the town's sheriff's page or whatever, and they give the stories of what happened for the
Mhm.
week, it's like somebody got pulled over for a little bit of weed, like those are the stories.
Mhm.
I'll never forget, I was like a teenager, and this was when we were still getting the newspaper to the house, and I'd read the newspaper, and they, in the back of the newspaper, there were all the stories of what was happening for the police that week, like the cases they had. And I kid you not, one of them was someone had their trash cans stolen and
Mm.
they were looking for the trash cans. Like, this was the news. It
Mhm.
was in the newspaper. Um, so they have, I forget what the amount is, but they have decriminalized a certain amount. It's not been legalized for like recreational use or anything. Um, but yeah, that's the thing around
Mhm.
here. It's like, again, what are the motivations, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So
And
yeah.
isn't and I don't know my geography very well at all right now since elementary school, but isn't DC near Maryland?
Yeah, it's about an hour drive from where I
Yeah.
live right now.
And so in DC, just with the recent elections, they just decriminalized all plant medicines. So that means, ayahuasca, peyote, magic mushrooms, cannabis, all these things now are decriminalized just an hour away from you. Um,
Mhm.
I thought that was fascinating because, my most of my dissertation research and my career path moving forward is based around psychedelics and psychedelic assisted psychotherapies and things like that. So this last election was huge for us who are advocates for this, like Oregon, legalizing psilocybin therapy and decriminalizing all drugs based on the Portugal model, and DC, the capital of our country, decriminalizing plant medicines was huge. That's like the first giant domino to fall. And I think,
Mhm.
it's really exciting for me being in the field I'm in. In the next 5 to 10 years, it could be, these could be revolutionary medicines that come to be available for therapists all over the country, in the next
Mhm.
5 to 10 years. So that's super fascinating. I'm just always curious about what it's like in different parts of the country. And um, sounds like you guys are slowly but surely coming on board with the cannabis. Cannabis in general was that's a big deal. The prohibition around cannabis initially was racially motivated and motivated by propaganda against people coming over from Mexico, and you know this gentleman, I forget his name. I'm not sure if it was Henry Anslinger. I know he played a part, but this major distributor and producer of paper in the United States actually was one of the major lobbyists against marijuana and cannabis being you know, he pushed for it to be illegal because he was afraid that hemp may replace paper, and so he didn't want his business to go under. So then they pegged it all on Mexicans coming across the border. That's actually where the name marijuana came from. It's actually a racially motivated name, and yeah, very interesting. But prohibition is a fascinating thing, and it's really cool to be alive this at this time right now, because we get to see for ourselves like all these major shifts in all sorts of areas, but that's enough about that. I just wanted to I definitely I want to ask about your current interests and your current research and things like that too. But before we get into that, to sort of set the stage and give a little background, so you've been doing jujitsu and Muay Thai for 10 plus years. And you mentioned before we got started on the show that you did some Shaolin training, and that was where you picked up jujitsu initially. And whenever I think of Shaolin, I think of Kung Fu. Um, um, and Shaolin Buddhist monks, doing amazing feats with like balancing on one finger, or running up walls, or some of those crazy things that they do by sticking metal through their bodies and things like that. The power of the mind is amazing with those folks. So um, yeah, I'd love to hear more about the details of sort of how you got introduced to martial arts and started, and then how your interest progressed. Because my interest in martial arts started when I was 4 years old, and since then I've been dabbling in a dozen or more different styles, and now I moved primarily to, it was MMA for a long time, but now it's primarily just specializing in Muay Thai and Jiu-Jitsu, and, turning pro in Jiu-Jitsu a couple of years ago. And um, so those have really been my passions, but I've studied a ton of different martial arts. So I want to hear about your journey.
Yeah, absolutely. So I I loved like martial arts as a kid. I would sit and watch Chuck Norris with my dad
Oh,
when
no.
I was like a kid, and I like totally dug it, and I just like loved it. Um and my dad, I remember when I was a kid, he would do martial arts and we'd go and watch him. And it like piqued my interest. I was like really young at the time.
What would he do?
Um
What style did he do?
I can't remember. It was pretty close to taekwondo. It was more of a traditional style, but when I was probably about 9 or 10, my parents really wanted me to do martial arts because I'm really petite. I was super small. I got picked on a lot and I got teased and bullied a lot. And so they just wanted me to have self defense. And I remember I was just so anxious and nervous as a kid. And I was like, I don't want to do it. I'm so scared.
Mm,
So I never went through with it. So when I was about 13 or 14, they were like pushing for it again. And at that time, I was like, you know what? I will do it. So I did a style that was very similar to Taekwondo. It was more traditional, had forms and self defense and techniques and sparring and all those components to it. And I enjoyed it. I liked it. But I remember when I then was going off to college. So I did that for a few years. I did that for about 4 or 5 years, black belt, that whole thing. But I remember as I got a little older, I was like, I really want to do martial arts, but I want something a bit more practical.
mhm.
Like, there's nothing wrong with Taekwondo, it serves a purpose. But I was like, if I'm going to be attacked by a man, like, I want to be able to have a fighting chance. Like,
Sure.
what do I do?
Yeah, plum
Um,
sparring's not super useful when you're in your real fight. They don't
no,
restart the fight every time you land a shot. It still continues.
or like a little boop on the forehead, like
Right,
I can't just boop you and back away. Like, it doesn't work.
right.
So I was like, I need something practical. So I was looking and doing research. And when I was at the University of Maryland, there was a jujitsu school not too far away from the university. And I was like, you know what? I'll just show up. I'll try out a class. I'll see how it goes. I fell in love. Like, it was an instantaneous love thing. I was
Really?
just like, oh my God, yes.
I mean,
It
most
was,
people most people don't fall in love instantaneously because of the difficulty. I mean, most people try out a class and they're like, haven't breathed this hard in a long time. I haven't been this tired from 15 minutes of wrestling in my life,
Yeah.
and most people don't come back.
Oh, I signed a 12-month contract
Oh
that
man.
night. I just was like, "Yep, take my money, I want this." Um, so I did a few jujitsu classes, but I also tried Muay Thai, and that was my first love. Like, I was just I was smitten with Muay Thai.
So great, so effective.
It's wonderful. Um, I was in school at the time and I was working at I had a job on campus and I was showing interest in wanting to compete. And I remember the owner of the gym, he was like, "Hey, like, why don't you come in and train a little bit more and then you can get ready for a competition, blah, blah, blah." I was like, I can't because my job, the hours I work. And he's like, "How much do you get paid?" And I can't remember what I was getting paid at the time, but I told him, and he goes, "Okay, I'll pay you the same amount if you quit your job and come here." I
Wow.
was like, "Oh, okay, that's cool, no problem." So I put in my 2 weeks notice at my on-campus job and I started working there. And so I got unlimited training opportunities. I trained all the time at that point. I was training 6 days a week. Um, and I had a smoker fight. After the smoker fight, I had a amateur event lined up. But the problem was I was having all these hip issues. It was getting to the point where, University of Maryland is a humongous campus, and it got to the point where I couldn't walk across campus anymore. I just was missing class. I couldn't walk across campus, it was too far. Um, there was a doctor at the jiu-jitsu school and he was like, "Oh, you probably just need like a steroid shot, just come into my office next week, I'll give you a shot and you'll be good to go in a few days." I was like, "Oh, awesome, he's gonna heal me up and I'll be fine and I'll get some shots every once in a while." So I remember I go to the appointment, and again I had an amateur fight, probably it's like a month away maybe. And he was like doing the exam and he was like, "You actually need an MRI." He's like, "This isn't just like a little, shot's gonna cure you type of thing." So I get an MRI of both of my hips and I've torn the cartilage in both of them, is what had happened.
So from
um
kicking?
yes, so my bones were also misshapen. So the way they were shaped, they were pinching at the cartilage,
Hmm.
and it was through all the repetition that it ultimately pinched and teared it. Um, so I had to have my amateur fight canceled. I had to get double hip surgery.
Wow.
That recovery took, it was about a solid year for the recovery on that. And when I came back, I was told by the doctor, Muay Thai is probably not the best option to return to. But they said, if you pace yourself in jujitsu, if you're just super mindful about what you're doing, jujitsu can be a thing for you. So at that point, I had to transition over to jujitsu. And it just became a recreational thing at that point. I mean, at one point, when I graduated college, I worked at the gym full time, and I was training quite a bit then. Um, but ultimately, I was like, "Hey, I'm going to get into counseling. I'm not going to do this as my career." But there was definitely a point in time where I wanted to do that as my career. Um, so yeah, that was brutal. That recovery. It was a very, very long process,
Yeah.
but
So tell
I
me,
was able to return.
yeah, tell me a little bit about, I mean, you told me what the injury was, and I think this is such a huge thing to talk about, on a podcast for other listeners out there who may be practitioners or who just get injured in life. And this is a huge, huge topic for us who are pursuing, or, like I have a master's degree in sport and performance psychology. So it's a huge piece of sports psychology, which is injury and injury rehabilitation on the psychological level. Um,
Hmm.
so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the recovery portion of your injury. With my martial arts career, and I was an athlete. I think I played like 6 or 7 varsity sports in high school, and just been an athlete my whole life and never had experienced any major physical injury until I think it was 2005. I was about 2 years into Jiu-Jitsu and MMA, and I was doing Krav Maga at the time and Sambo and um, doing all these things. And one day, I decided to go to jujitsu practice early in the morning, and that morning had been from not really feeling it. Just, my gut was telling me like today is just not your day. You shouldn't go. But I forced myself to go anyway. And that's another interesting piece of psychology too, is how your psychology plays into the initiation of injury too. So I decided to go, and then in the middle of practice, my right ACL exploded during a takedown, like completely
Oof.
severed. Looked like spaghetti noodles around this open chasm in my knee when I got it MRI'd. And that was the first major injury I had ever had in any sport. And it wrecked me psychologically. Physically, I got the surgery done. Unfortunately, it was a botched surgery. They put a cadaver tendon in there that had a staph infection on it.
Ooh.
So I had to have multiple surgeries afterwards to clean out the
Mhm.
infection and remove it and put in a different one. They actually modified their national protocols for tendon transplanting based on my surgery. So my doctor at the time published an article based off of my case, and so I guess something beneficial came out of it that I got to help improve the protocols. But it was brutal. Like I was on painkillers for years, mismanaged on painkillers, constantly getting a surgery, feeling good in the recovery, and then, having to get another surgery and then another 6 months of recovery. And I slipped back into depression. I slipped back into addiction. Um, at that point, I had been sober from alcohol for 4.5 years, and the mismanagement of opiates put me back into alcohol addiction. It was just brutal. And I think the hardest part was not the physical recovery. Like I had the fortitude and the willpower to make it through those things. And I could pace myself for a 20-year-old, I guess, pacing myself, getting back in the gym. But coming back from the depression and the loss of identity, because I was so wrapped up in this identity of being an athlete, and now all that was stripped away. That was the toughest part, and I didn't have a sports psychologist to talk to about it and to get through it. I had to discover for myself. So grateful I discovered this, and I share this with my clients all the time that, oftentimes, like I believe that the universe puts things in our path for a reason. And for me, I was just going so hard that the universe put a stop to my progress with that injury. And it wanted me to slow myself down and to take a look around and to broaden what I thought of myself, who I am, right? Like we said in the very beginning, like getting beyond the superficialities of who I thought I was and my
Mhm.
identity. And it forced me to peel away all those layers because I couldn't do any of those things. And it forced me to really look at who I was as a core self. And
Mhm.
so, and now I can look back at those injuries and that time in my life with a lot of gratitude because with because of that injury and all that stuff, like I got to realize that I was so much more than an athlete. I was a student. I was a roommate. I was a brother. I was a son. I was a friend. And I got to pour a lot more energy into these other areas of my life that I had been neglecting in favor of my athletics. And
Mhm.
so I think that's how I pulled myself out of that depression was realizing like I'm not just an athlete. I'll come back. That piece of me will come back. Um, but I am so much more than what I thought, and my potential is so much greater than what I was before. Um, so what was it like for you? I mean, I'm dealing with one knee, and since then I've had 9 surgeries on that knee. I've had one surgery on the other knee. I've had my bicep reattached. I've had countless broken noses and orbital fractures and things like that. But a double hip injury at one time. I mean, I'm picturing you like laid up in one of those half body casts, like you can't even walk. Um,
Pretty close.
yeah, like what was that like? I mean, not just not being able to be an athlete at the time, but now you're also dealing with like I can't even walk. I can't even function as a basic, mobility thing that I used to as a human. So what was that recovery like for you psychologically?
Yeah, I mean, the recovery was tough because, well, I had them, the surgeries were spaced out by about 3 weeks, but the one leg was still recovering when they went in on the second one. So, but on the second one, I had an infection. Um, well, first, during the surgery, it's all done, laparoscopically. Um, and when they went into the joint, one of the tools broke off inside the
Oh
joint.
no.
And so it took an extra hour and a half than what it should have. And I think that probably contributed to the recovery because the second one was way worse than the first one. Um, and there was infection and things like that. But like you said, you stop and you have like almost like a little crisis about your
Mhm.
identity.
Yeah.
You're like, oh, like who am I? Because same thing, I've always been in sports. In high school, I was on varsity sports. I played this, I played that, martial arts, and all of my identity was in this one basket
Mhm.
of being a martial art athlete. Like that's all it was. And so it made me stop and say, who else am I? And that's actually what led me to go back to school
Mhm.
and to pursue, being a counselor. But I think injury, when you are so wrapped up in sport like that, where it becomes your identity, injury is make or break for people like that. Um, even for a hobbyist, it could be like that. But when you're really like in the depths of training and you're like, this is what I'm going to do, it's make or break. Either you make it through an injury and you come out stronger, or you become defeated a lot of the time. Of course, people can find a middle ground, but I feel like most of the time either it really wrecks a person or they come out 10 times stronger than what they went in. And so for me, I think it was just like this time of enlightenment almost where I could be like, you know what? There's more to me than just this martial artist. Um, you know, I'm a really caring and kind and compassionate person. How can I make a life out of that? I like to listen. I like to just hear people out. So it allowed me to say, okay, who else am I outside of this?
Mhm.
Um, because I don't want to say it wasn't healthy, but I had put all my eggs in one basket. And, I didn't have a backup plan. I didn't have an idea of what else to do. So it forced me to do that. And I think too, injuries can become this whole thing of becoming comfortable with like the uncomfortable.
Mhm.
Like, for example, something that really bummed me out and messed with my head was while I was injured, I would still go and watch class and take notes and things like that. Um, but I wouldn't participate, and I would watch people that I was at a similar skill level get promoted.
Mhm.
And like that just crushed me. I was like, oh, like if this didn't happen, I would be getting promoted with them right now. Or, when I made my comeback and you're just getting your butt handed to you. And I'm like, oh my God, my skill is so low right now. I'm so out of practice. I'm so out of shape. So it messes with your mind. But I came out of it so much better off and like so
Mhm.
much stronger. Um, and just being in a better place in general when I came out of it. But I remember that was the most brutal part when you saw your peers who were kind of on par with you just excel and get promoted and their skill level is going up. That was the hard part for me. That was the hardest part.
Yeah, and something there's something to that piece about, going through challenge and overcoming challenge in order to make you more resilient, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I kind of liken it to this psychology term of post-traumatic growth, you know,
Mm-hmm.
um, how you can actually become a stronger person by going through a trauma and coming out the other end, in a positive way. Like you could be stronger than you ever would have been had you not gone through the trauma at all, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I like to view obstacles these days, injuries or setbacks or whatever it is, from tendonitis to blown out joints or whatever, um, as opportunities for growth.
Mm-hmm.
That this trauma, this pain that I'm feeling right now, yeah, it sucks on some level, but it's also a good teacher. It's helping me to learn about myself and to grow as a human being and to grow as an athlete. And so when I
Mm-hmm.
come back on the mat, not only am I going to have this additional knowledge, but now if a training partner goes through something similar, I can become a helpful or a useful teacher for them too, to help them go through it more easily. Your story about getting back into school for counseling, it mirrors mine so well. I didn't know. I was sort of after my undergrad, so I tore my knee right at the end of my undergrad, and I didn't know. I knew I needed to get a master's degree in order to get a decent job in psychology, but I didn't know
Yep.
which path to go. So I was considering going to Naropa University for a Buddhist contemplative psychotherapy degree. And then I got this injury, and I was like, holy shit, I just made it through this injury, and came out the other side. And I wish I had somebody who would have helped me through it. There's got to be a field of psychology out there like this. And then I found sports psychology. I'm like, nope, that's what I'm going to go for. I want to be that person that helps other people get through what I just went through, because I didn't have that help and I could have benefited so much from it. So that's really
Mm-hmm.
what spurred my interest in sports psychology. And then once I was in my program, I think the my long I mean I'd been doing psychedelics since I was 16, and that was really what my first experience with psychedelics. I didn't really have an interest in the mind or spirituality or anything beyond the ego, superficial identity self. But after my first experience, that was totally blown open, and my interest in psychology and the mind was like primary in my life. And
Mm-hmm.
then when I got into my sports psych program and started learning about flow states, I was like, oh my goodness, like here it comes again. These altered states are coming back into my realm. And now there's a whole new angle on it. It's not just about altered states for recreation or altered states for greater spirituality, but now we can engage altered states for greater human performance. What?
Mm-hmm.
Like that was so cool to me. And cannabis had always been a part of my well, at least my martial arts career through college, because I there was no studies on it back then about performance, but I from an experiential point of view, like got a lot of benefit from it. With jujitsu, like it would slow my mind down so that I could be more in the moment. It may slow my reaction time just a little bit, but the benefits that I got for pain relief and all these other things, so it was a big part of it. And so altered states, I started exploring that a little bit more with performance. And now, there's not that many people in the psychedelic field looking into performance enhancement for psychedelics, but there is a huge growing trend with microdosing for athletics. Tons of UFC fighters are now microdosing during their fights. Athletes from all sorts of different sports are utilizing microdoses of psychedelics to improve their performance. Silicon Valley's using it for creativity and tech and all that stuff. So it's really cool to see my love of sport and altered states and human performance optimization just all sort of coming together and blending together in my life. It feels like it's totally natural, and it makes me it validates sort of my path that I'm on, and I just love that. So yeah, flow states in sports psychology is really what got me hooked. And I'm sure when you got into sports psychology, having been an athlete for a long time, you were able to, it's so much fun being an athlete and studying sports psychology, because you can take what you're learning in class and like directly apply it to your training and be like, oh, this worked. I'm so much better athlete right now. Do you have any instances like that?
Absolutely. I mean, you know, first, the program that I am at, it was initially a sport and performance psychology program, like strictly that.
Mhm,
So that's what I was doing heavy for at least a year. And then a year into the program, they introduced a clinical mental health program
mhm,
with a subspecialty in sport and performance psychology. So I then switched over, but I was like, this is great because I can keep the sport and performance psychology piece with me. Because, like you said, as an athlete, it's just like the perfect blend of all your interests. And I feel like the greatest lessons learned are definitely about mental toughness.
mhm,
I think that's a big part of recovery too, is like you test your mental toughness. Like you see if, hey, is this injury going to make me or break me? So definitely mental toughness was the biggest one. All the mental skills training you do,
mhm,
like trying to get better at imagery. Like I suck at imagery. And so learning the techniques and the strategies and being like, okay, Nicole, like you can improve your imagery, you can do it. So all those little strategies uh, that you learn about in your skills training class is like wonderful. Even just learning about different apps that are out there for you to use, right? Like there's just so much um, kind of at our fingertips in sport and performance psychology, and there's so many resources and things that you can use. Yeah, I would say the mental toughness, like just finding that extra bit of gas in the tank when you think the tank is dry is like, it's a big game changer. It
mhm,
just changes everything. It just allows you to persevere. But for me as well, like what I really love about what I'm doing right now is that my dissertation is inspired by my own experiences and like what I've learned. And so my dissertation is looking at the personality traits of women in combat sports compared to women who do not train combat sport.
mhm,
And it uses the DISC assessment. And the reason I chose the DISC assessment um, is because it it includes the context, like it includes the environment. I was like, you know what? There aren't a ton of women that train combat sport compared to men. I mean, there is a good number, but we know it's a male dominated enterprise. And it was just like, what is it about me as a woman? When I was doing Muay Thai, I would spar with men. And I'm like, what is it about me as a woman that is completely okay with getting punched in the face by a guy that's like 70 pounds heavier than me?
mhm,
And like, I'm cool with it. And I actually enjoy it. Like, what? And you're like, there's got to be something about these women that sets them apart, right? Now, whether that's to say that if you have these traits, you're more likely to do sport, or does sport attract these traits, whatever it may be, the actual relationship, I'll have to study that. But just this idea that there's something different about women that train in a male dominated enterprise, right? Like there's something that makes you tick a little bit differently. And that's what inspired it, like what what allows a woman to go into that setting that may not necessarily always be conducive to women. um, I've trained at some really great places with some great environments, but I've heard a lot of stories from women and read a lot of stories from women where maybe they don't have as great of a training experience. Like, it is out there, it happens. But it's like, hey, what's different about you? Like what makes you tick in a different way? um because it is, it's like that doesn't make a lot of sense. Like, why would I be okay being punched in the face?
Hmm.
And so I want to get to the bottom of that. I want to say, is there a difference? Like, do we see that maybe these women are more dominant? Um, there has been some previous research, but not really that much. Um, Most populations are male populations or co-ed populations. They aren't typically strictly female populations, so that'll be something different. And again, looking at the context, you have to take into account the environment. I don't think you can just ignore that piece. So taking that into consideration as well. Um, so it was just like a marriage of my personal interests and my academic interests and my sport interests all coming together to create the dissertation that I'm working on.
Do you have a So you said there's not been too much research done in the past, but do you have any? Okay, so how do I put this for the audience so that they understand sort of what we go through with the dissertation piece? So usually when we formulate research questions for a dissertation, like we're exploring something that is hopefully personally interesting to us. Um, that'll give us more fuel, motivation to get through the long process and to finish it. Um, but oftentimes, when we're asking a question, we need to ask it in a way that is as non-biased as possible, and that is not leading, and that is not necessarily, setting ourselves up for later criticism if we choose to publish based on our question. But so that's part of the process of doing the research itself. But in the background, like as a researcher, like we're drawn to these certain topics because we have an inclination that there might be something there, right?
Mhm.
And so that's what I'm really interested in asking you is like, do you have like a hypothesis about what personality characteristics or personality traits um, could be playing a factor in some of these women who choose to pursue it? And you did say women who train combat sports, and I think there needs to be, and you probably do this already, but there needs to be like a distinction made between women who train it, because a lot of women try it out, uh, going through the door, which is very scary and takes a lot of courage to do in the first place. But there's a difference between women who try it out and women who like actively pursue it as like a part of their lifestyle, part of their identity, and they love it, right? So what is your hypothesis? What do you think is going on with women who just this is their jam,
Yeah.
versus women who don't want to step foot through that door in the first place, or women who go in and they're like, this is just not for me?
Yeah. So let me first say about the previous research and then segue into that.
Mhm.
So the previous research, um, it looked at, gosh, no more, it was definitely no more than 200 women. And it looked at a couple of personality traits. And basically, what they said is women who train are more masculine. And I was like, okay, well, that sounds like a very broad
Yeah.
statement. And
Yeah, like what
like,
does that even mean?
you're not giving us much. I'm like, okay. And you know what? I'm like, that's kind of the stereotypical answer, right? Is like, oh, they're more manly. I'm like, okay, so we gotta elaborate on that. That ain't cutting it, right? And then I recently just found another research article that I used for a different course. But basically, what they said is that, you know, in in the world we've made these constructs of masculine, feminine, and androgynous. And they were saying people who train are masculine or androgynous. There are no feminine profiles in the sample that they looked at. And it was quite a large sample. And I'm like, okay, again, it's in line with that whole masculine versus feminine thing. And oh, they're really manly or whatever. And I was like, I want some different descriptors, right? Like, first off, you're not telling us many more than what people assume. People make these assumptions that you got to be real rough and tough and rugged and rough around the edges. Again, going into the masculine versus feminine thing. So when I was looking at an assessment to use, I was like, I don't want something that's just so it kind of felt generic in a sense.
Mhm.
Like I don't want to just produce this generic man woman thing. Um, so I chose the disc because it takes the environment into account. And disc is dominance, influence, steadiness, and conscientiousness. And so un- I was thinking, how does that relate to what's already been found? So the idea is that, yeah, they'll be different, the women who train versus the women who don't train, but will they have higher dominance scores, right? Because dominance is the most closely related to having like that gender thing to it. So the idea is they have a higher D score out of the DISC. Um, and I mean that's kind of where my mind is going with that. And then in terms of looking at the women who train, a part of the survey is you have to explain how often you train. Are you training at a hobbyist level? Are you training at like a recreational level? Are you training at an amateur level? Or are you training at a professional level? So the idea is, yes, we're going to look at these two broad groups, women who do train versus women who don't train. But then can we look within the group of women that train, and are the people who are training more, and it's like who they are as a person, are their characteristics different than the women who train? Well, I do once in a while, you know?
Mhm.
So I do ask them to clarify their level of involvement so that way I can get extra data out of it as well.
Sure. Yeah, that's super interesting, and it's I think it does a the earlier research, it's just scratching the surface, and it almost does a disservice to the question because,
Mhm.
I mean, you can't just say more masculine women do it, because there are clear examples of some very feminine women who are professionals in some of these sports. I mean, I think of like Mackenzie Dern or, um, I just had another one in mind, but I can't remember her name. But these, Rose Namajunas, right? The very feminine, beautiful. Like they might be more dominant, personality wise, but they're not masculine by any means.
Mhm.
So that's way too general. And I love how you're trying to pick apart some of the details there and the nuances there. Have you been having some good success with your study so far?
Yeah, I mean, so far so good. The ideal number is 200 participants. I'm at 166 right now.
Oh, that's a lot.
So, yeah, just like trying to close that gap a little bit, getting some more women who don't train. I, you know what I was worried about? I was like, oh, I'm gonna have plenty of women who don't train fill this in. I'm
Mhm.
gonna have a hard time getting the women who do train to fill it in. I checked my stats after a few weeks and I had like 120 women who did train and I had 13 who didn't. I was like, what? So I'm actually trying to get more women who don't train right now. I'm going to keep having the numbers come in until around January 5th, and then I'm going to analyze the data then. But yeah, so it's going well. Just really eager to like finally sit down, crunch some numbers, and be like, what's the deal? Like, what's happening? Because, like you said, it's not fair to say, oh, they're more masculine. Because
Mhm.
that's, you never want to paint things with this broad brush that is a sweeping generalization. Um, there's more to it than that. And there's more to those women than that, than just being like, oh, you're a tomboy, or oh, you're just like uh, one of the guys, or whatever. Like, there's so much more to it. Like, you have to. People are humans are just so multifaceted and complex with so many layers to them. Like, you just can't smack labels like that on people. It's not fair. So I am super interested to see what comes of it.
And how long have you been working on your actual dissertation project?
So I'm 3 quarters in. My school does quarters. So I'm 3 quarters in. I start my fourth quarter next week. And
So you proposed like last summer?
yeah, was it last summer? Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. not good with time. Um, so it's been, yeah, about 9 months or so that I've been doing it. 8, 9 months. Um, so it'll be, writing up the discussion section and talking about the results, and then writing it up for publication and submitting it to some different journals, and fingers crossed to get something published, hopefully.
Hmm. So, yeah, you're getting close to being done. How's that
Yeah,
feel?
it is. It's in the home stretch. I'll be honest, I'm a little bit in crisis mode because going back to the identity piece, I'm
Hmm.
like, oh my God, what do I do? Like, my whole student identity is going bye bye soon,
Hmm.
and that is terrifying. It's like I have been pursuing academia for so long now. For the last 13 years, I've been in school more than I haven't been in school. So it's a little bit of like stopping, pausing, and being like, what do I do next? What exact, I have a general idea of what I'm going to do, but it's like, who do I become after this part of me kind of, we close the doors on that part and open some new doors? It's a little terrifying. It's a little terrifying. So that's the piece I'm working through right now in my personal life, is like, okay, how do I grapple with this and how do I move forward?
So, are you working right now too at the same time as you're doing your dissertation?
No, I'm not doing any therapy or anything like that right now. Um, for me, I just wanted to get my courses done, wanted to, get the dissertation written, um, applying to jobs in the meantime. But no, after I finished my internship, I was like, I got to take a step back from therapy while I do the dissertation, because it's just a lot, you're like writing a dissertation at night, and you come home from work, and then you're worried about that client that was suicidal the other day. And I was like, I can't handle that right now. I gotta just focus on this, get it produced, get it out there, and then go back and revisit therapy again.
Yeah, right now I'm only doing therapy on the weekends in my private practice.
Mm-hmm.
I dedicate the weekdays for school, and I'm only 3 semesters in, so I have one more semester of coursework, and then that sort of chapter of my academic career is over. Like no more classes,
Mm-hmm.
and then I'll be taking my comps next summer and proposing for my dissertation next fall. But I am so looking forward to actually just hitting the ground running and beginning the research so that I can you know I love school. If I could, I would stay in school for the rest of my life,
I
so I
say
don't
the
have to
same
work.
thing. Yes, I'm like, can I just be a perpetual student? Like, that would be
Exactly.
wonderful. I like just
Just pay me to
Should
learn.
I be paid to learn?
Mhm,
Yeah. Oh, I love being in school.
mhm.
Um, when a dissertation came up, I was like super into it. I was like, I love this stuff. Because like I said, I was a research assistant in undergrad, and I was also a research assistant. After I finished my master's, I went into research for a little while. But I love learning. I love reading research articles. Like, that stuff like makes me happy.
Mhm.
So when the dissertation came along, people are like, "Oh my god, like that's so hard. I would never do that." And I'm like, "Nope, this is my cup of tea. I dig it. Like, I'm all about it." So I completely understand what you're saying. I'm the exact same way.
Yeah, and I'm sure, and for me certainly, but I'm sure for you too, like participating in such a strenuous activity or sport as jujitsu, like where you're constantly dealing with literally like your body doesn't know the difference between faking a life or death situation and actual life or death situation. So you're constantly training like under that level of stress when someone's choking you or hyperextending your joints or something, and then you overcome those challenges on a daily basis. You go in there, and for me, like this idea of ego death and things like that that come out of the psychedelic realm, like I experience that all the time on the mat when I'm training with my black belt professor, and he's just smashing my ego into the mat, right? And then
Mm-hmm.
I walk away, um, I consider the mats like that's like my spiritual sanctuary, and
Hmm.
when I step off the mat, I'm a whole new person because I have just, overcome who I thought I was and then stepped into this new role. And for me anyway, like dealing with that on the mat in a simulated fashion every single day that I do makes the rest of life just so much easier. So then I look at, like a big project, like a dissertation, or, my biggest projects right now are like 20 or 30-page papers or something. And others are like, oh my God, I could never do something like that. I'm like, this is like cakewalk compared to the Shark Tank I just experienced on the mat the other day. This is a piece of
Yes,
cake.
exactly. I'm like, oh, you know what? When you have like a man twice your size sitting on your chest trying to like basically strangle you, it's like, mm-mm, nope, this is easy. I will write that paper any day,
Mhm,
no problem. But like, please get off of me.
mhm.
Like let me get free. Yeah, it's all relative. It's like, yeah, when you have this over here compared to that over there, I'm like, oh yeah, that's easy compared to that.
Yeah. Yeah. In my sports psych program, I took a society and sport class, and our final project was to write up a sort of like a program that we would want for to implement within society that involves sport. And mine was making jujitsu like a mandatory class for middle school and high schoolers.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of like PE, but even today, like PE isn't even mandatory these days. But make it something mandatory so that everyone gets a basic level, maybe up to a blue belt by the time they graduate. And I think it would not only reduce the amount of bullying going on in schools and the amount of
Mm-hmm.
violence, because once you learn a martial art, like you don't want to be violent because you know what you're capable of, and you know what how fragile the human body is. You don't want to
Mm-hmm.
impose that on anyone. But it would like improve confidence in people, would probably improve resilience for the work world, getting jobs, things like that. Oh, is that your dog?
Oh yeah, can you see him?
Just a set. Oh, there he is.
He
Nice,
just popped up. Yeah.
nice. Yeah, sometimes my dogs come on and I call them my co-hosts, but try and keep them out of the room as much as possible.
Yeah. Oh, he's a little demon sometimes,
Yeah.
but yeah, it's just like, yeah, I would have to agree with that. It's just it really is a lesson in a lot of things doing jujitsu and just what it teaches us. And um yeah, it's great.
Hmm.
We just love it. I mean, you know how it is. You just like fall in love with it. And I think you said something important before, which is lifestyle, right? Like once you get into it, it's a lifestyle. Being a student like in academia and being involved in academia, like it's part of that lifestyle, right? Like we each create our own lifestyle based on all the interesting components of who we are. It comes together to create this very unique little lifestyle. um so yeah, my lifestyle will be changing soon
Hmm.
in a, in a few months. But yeah, it's good stuff. Have you been training during COVID?
Oh yeah.
Okay,
We
how's that
we
going?
Oh, it's going great. We shut down our gym for the first few months, but we opened back up, I think, in July, and we've been going ever since. For the first few months, we had limited numbers in our classes. Everyone had their own taped off area, and we were only doing single person drills, which was really hard for me as an instructor to try and teach jujitsu to my students without having a partner for them, right? So like this very physical and intimate sport that requires close contact. Um, Trying to teach technique without that resistance, without that partner, was really hard for me as an instructor. Um, but I think in September maybe we transitioned to full contact again. We still wear masks when we
Mm-hmm.
train, which is some people hate it and they complain about it. But again, I try and see challenge as like an opportunity for growth. So for me, like I remind myself that breathing through a mask when you're training is going to make you that much better on the, in the real world when you don't have a mask and you need to be able to breathe. So it's sort of like, I'm already at high altitude, but it's like high altitude training, when
Hmm.
you're inhaling this mask too, and all this CO2, training your body to perform at even a higher stress. I think that'd be an interesting study too, to not only look at the psychology, but the actual physical performance of jiu-jitsu athletes wearing a mask during COVID versus not wearing a mask, and their perceptions. But yeah, we're training, 5 nights a week, and we're doing Muay Thai, and I'm teaching Muay Thai, once a week, and so yeah, it's really good. Um, and I really hope, like you said, like all of our interests coming together and lifestyle and things like that. Like I'm hoping in the future to be able to, the dissertation is just, it's supposed to be, it's this magnum opus for us when we're in it, but
Hmm.
we're constantly told like, this is the worst work you're ever going to do, in
Yeah.
the profession. So I try and keep that in my mind, that this is just, like a way to open the door for me
Hmm.
to be able to do more of what I want to do. And so I definitely want to do research in the psychedelic realm, but I would really like to marry, um, psychedelics and sports together in research. And I've talked with a number of black belts in jiu-jitsu that I know, over the past few years, and you'd be totally surprised at how many of them, they're like, I would so be willing to do a microdosing study, or a cannabis study with jujitsu. Like, just let me know when you're doing it, and I'll sign up. So I think someday I'm going to marry those two, and do some kind of, altered states, maybe related to flow states, and because microdosing and cannabis, seem to be showing to be able to, induce flow states, and to hold flow states for longer periods. So, that could be a future study that we see with combat sports, that I might want to do. So you said you have some idea of what you want to do next with your life after you finish. What are some of those ideas that you want to do? Academia, private practice, like what are some of your ideas?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, to be in the field, you need to have a license. So I'm going to have to go out, do the license. But the nice thing is that my state, um, if you have a master's level, you need a certain number of hours. But if you have a doctorate level degree, you need less hours.
Mhm.
So the nice thing is that once I get my doctorate, I'll be able to get my license in about a year. So the first year after graduating is just going to be just like you just gotta bite the bullet and do it, get the license. But after that, I love academia. It's where my heart belongs. I love research. So ideally, I would do the bulk of my work in research and academia, and then have a private practice on the side where I maybe do a few days a week, a nice small caseload. If I could work with female combat sport athletes, that would be super ideal. Like you said, those who have had injuries where you can, relate and help them out. So that's kind of like my trajectory right now. So it'll just be the first year of just doing what I got to do, get the license under my belt, and then hopefully branching off into doing the bulk of academia and research with a little private practice on the side.
And hopefully still incorporating martial arts training into your life too.
Oh, that's a given. Like that's gonna happen no matter what. That will always be around. You will have to drag my body off the mat before I'm like, no, I'm not training anymore. You'll have to drag me out of there kicking and screaming. Um, it'll always be in my life. As long as I'm able to physically do it, I'll be doing it.
Mhm. Yeah, and even, I've told people, if both my legs stop working tomorrow, like, I'm still gonna find a way to do jujitsu with
Yeah, you
just
got
my
your armor
arms.
hat. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, what belt level are you at in jujitsu?
Oh gosh, I'm still at a blue belt. I
That was
mean,
my longest one. I think it was
yeah,
6 years at a blue belt.
And it's really hard because I've moved several times,
Mm,
um, which every time you move and you go to a new school, which this is totally acceptable and understandable, but you have to kind of prove yourself, right? Like
mhm,
you have to prove your loyalty to the school. You have to show that you're not just jumping around from place to place. Um, because I remember when I went to New York, so I trained at um, Vidor Shaolin's place. Um, I mean, a legend, the Shaolin sweep. Hello, learning it from Shaolin himself. And I remember when I went there, um, I'm really fortunate that the school I started at, really great competition team. The owner was super, super like technical. So I got a lot of technical knowledge. So when I went to Shaolin's, they said, we do think you're like at a level to get promoted to blue belt, but you have to show us that you're going to stay here a while, that you're committed to the team. So they said, we're not going to consider you for promotion until at least 6 months. Well, they only did promotions, I think it was twice a year. So in that 6 months, I missed the promotion because I had to wait. And then after New York, I moved back to Maryland. So then it was like, well, I had my hip injury in there too. Um, so the hip injury was almost a year and a half of waiting as well. Um, and then, just like moving a lot. So it's really hard because I've moved from Maryland to New York, back to Maryland. I went back to New York again, came back to Maryland. I lived in Puerto Rico for a little while, came back to Maryland. So all those moves, I'm like constantly trying to like re get my bearings again. But yeah, blue belt, like you said, it's the belt where I think it makes or breaks a lot of people.
mhm.
Either you drop out or you keep going.
Yep.
Um, because if you just look at the stats in jujitsu, blue belt does statistically have the highest drop off rate. It's where most people do drop off, but yeah, I've been a blue belt at least how many years? Oh gosh, at least 4 years or so. Like I said, there was, when I lived in Puerto Rico, it was really hard to find training. So I was off the mats for at least another 8 months to a year then because there wasn't anywhere to train. And then I found somewhere and it was far away, blah, blah, blah. So right now I'm just still in that blue belt grind, just making it through. Um, like I said, I'm not a very competitive person either. So I'm like, oh, I'm cool. I'm here just learning.
Mhm,
Don't mind me. Um, so I don't really get into like how many stripes I have or anything. I'm like, I'm just a blue belt. And when I'm ready to be a purple belt, I'll be a purple belt. And it'll happen. Uh, so yeah, that's the goals for the immediate future are to get back to training. I'm not training right now just because I have some people in my life who are definitely vulnerable populations and who would just probably be way worse off if they got COVID. They may not recover so easily. So just because I'm in close contact with people like that, I've been trying to just isolate as much as possible.
mhm.
And, my family asked me, hey, could you not train right now? Because, we're higher risk. So I'm just kind of like respecting their wishes. So, hopefully this simmers down a bit, vaccines come out, blah, blah, blah. So getting back on the mats and graduating are the two goals right now. That's what's at the end of the tunnel. I see the light. I just got to get there.
Yeah. I have a theory about the COVID piece and training. So my wife she's like way up to date, way more than I am on the COVID thing, just because I a part of my lifestyle, I suppose, and how I choose to approach life is I choose not to live in fear.
Hmm.
Um, and I see so many people out there just living in fear like every second of the day. I'm like, what kind of life is that? So I choose not to like really worry too much about COVID. Like I take responsible and ethical measures, um, but I'm not worried about it.
Hmm.
My immune system is strong. And if I get it, I get it, and I'll be fine. Um, and so. So this conversation has come up a couple times between she and I have a theory about COVID and gyms. So she tells me that the statistics and the research is showing that gyms, and this isn't martial arts gyms. This is like regular weightlifting gyms and things, are not an area for high transmission, like
Mm-hmm.
they first thought they were, right? So a lot
Yeah.
more those kind of gyms are opening up. But jujitsu is a bit different, right? Like we're close physical contact. Sometimes we're sweating in each other's mouths,
Mm-hmm.
like we're sharing blood, sweat, and tears like on the mat with each other. And when I get off the mat, oftentimes I have bodily fluids from like 20 different people, and so my theory is, and I don't know, I'm not a immunologist or anything, but my theory is that by going to jujitsu and training with a bunch of people who don't have COVID, and sharing our microbiomes in that way, then I'm getting exposure and my immune system is getting even stronger by exposing
Mm-hmm.
myself to that. Sort of like putting a baby in the dirt, or raising a baby in a dusty environment. They're much less likely to get autoimmune diseases and asthma and things like that versus
Mm-hmm.
sterile environment. Then their immune system isn't used to that stuff. So that's my theory, is like I go and train in order to keep myself safer for COVID, um, versus like if I was just like at the beginning of COVID when everything was shut down, like um, there were theories, not actual studies coming out, but theories that the more closed in we are in our own environments, then our immune systems are going to get weaker and weaker and weaker by doing
Mm-hmm.
that. So that is a big worry of mine. I don't want my immune system to take a hit. So I'm out there exposing myself to people who I know are safe in that way in order to strengthen my system. And who knows if that's true or not, but that's the theory I'm going with. And so far, so good. I'm knock on wood.
It's a solid theory. I dig it. I think
Yeah.
it totally works. I mean, it just I definitely see what you're saying. It just is, when your parents like explicitly ask you, I'm like, oh
Yeah,
God.
totally.
Even though I'm in my 30s, at the end of the day, it's still like I gotta listen to my mom and dad. I'm like, okay, if it makes you more comfortable, I won't do it.
Hmm.
But I'm itching to get back there because again, it's like you're, you know, going back to identity. Like my stress reliever, what I do for my mental health is
Yeah.
missing right now,
Yeah.
and I'm like going bonkers over here because I'm like I can't train. And when you are taken out of training for a little while, you really quickly come to realize what it does for you mentally, emotionally, physically. I'm like, I'm out of I'm out of shape now. When I go back, I'm gonna die. I know that. I'm gonna be like, you know, gasping for air. But being out of shape and missing the social connection, missing that community, that family, um, what it just does for my emotional and mental well-being. So it's like it's tough right now, like having that piece missing. Um, so it'll be a good day the day I step back on the mats.
Hmm. Or it could be hell.
It's
Oh,
gonna
it'd be
be
both.
like one of those weird, like where you like the pain of it, where you're like, this sucks, but deep down inside, it's great.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, I don't want to take any more of your time. It's been wonderful having you for this last couple hours to talk. And I just want to say, I really appreciate you coming on the show today to talk about all the things, all your background and the research that you're doing, the awesome research you're doing. And I hope that the listeners out there, if you're not a female combat athlete, maybe you know one and you can find Nicole's email address in the description of the podcast and reach out to her and get her some more research participants. Or if you're a female out there and you don't do combat sports and you want to be a part of this research, because it is super important, please reach out to her. She needs more people like that too. So thanks, Nicole, for coming on. I really, really appreciate it. And best of luck to you in your future endeavors.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a blast. Like you said, any and all women, reach out. Let's get these numbers up there so we can produce some really good results that can open the door to more opportunities and more discussion and having the important discussions we need to have. So definitely reach out. And it's been a blast. Thank you so much.
Yeah. And we'll have to have you on again in the future when you're, done with your dissertation or you're back to training, either one.
I'm totally down for that.
All right. Well, thanks again. And thanks to the listeners. This has been Conversations with the Mind. We'll see you next time. Conversations with the Mind podcast is sponsored by mindops.com. You can find us at www.mind-ops.com. We're an eclectic counseling company providing mental health and mental performance services to individuals, small and large groups, teams, businesses, military, through face-to-face sessions or at a distance using phone or confidential video chat apps. We bring a unique Buddhist Western lens and specialize in general psychotherapy for all mental difficulties, sport and performance psychology for performance enhancement, addiction counseling for any maladaptive or destructive habits, and psychedelic integration therapy to make the most from your visionary medicine work. We are available as well for corporate workshops to address the needs of your employees' wellness.